Alrighty. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. I know it's a bit of a tough time. Brisbane, where we are, is just got a couple of COVID things going on. So I'm mindful that there is a press conference for that at 11 a.m. This is meant to finish at 11 a.m. So we might finish a little bit early, give everyone a bit of time to get on that. So we'll get this underway. So who am I? My name's Alexander Steffan. I'm a private consultant town planner. I have a Bachelor of Urban and Environmental Planning from Griffith University way back in 2008. I'm the Director of Steffan Town Planning, Director and Founder of Properties, and Director and Founder of URPEC, which is the Urban and Regional Planning Education Centre, which I'll tell you a bit more about later on. A little bit about us. We're located in East Brisbane, just along Stanley Street, convenient walking distance to the Gabba. So can't wait for cricket season. We've been operating for about 13 years, since 2008, and in our office there's 40 years of experience with 6 to 7 staff, including a development manager. So if there's a planning issue that you have, undoubtedly we've probably encountered it before. If I haven't personally, someone else in our office has. What does Steffan Town Planning do? So if you're attending this webinar, undoubtedly, you know what Steffan Town Planning does, you know what a town planner does. So I'll go through this quickly. So we gain development approvals through local council. So for example, subdivisions, extensions, granny flats, dual occupancies, auxiliary units. We only operate in Queensland. So sorry, if you're outside of Queensland, we can certainly refer you to someone. We have a great contact in New South Wales now. So please let us know. We're still happy to help you. We also provide development consulting services, being if you have no idea what you want to do and you just need some advice, we can have a look and steer you in the right direction, or at least give you all of your options available. We also coordinate developments, which is kind of like a project management service without the project management. So we can take a subdivision from, an idea right through to execution and giving you new titles. So that's very handy for people interstate or people who have a full-time job and don't necessarily have the time to dedicate to actually handling the whole process. We also deal with show cause matters. If you've done something wrong, you will receive a show cause notice, so we can deal with that. Due diligence reporting, again, doing a bit of a summary on what your options are on a particular property before you buy it. We also do public consultation, and we're Risk Smart accredited everywhere that you can be. So what's going on? There we go. So today we are doing a masterclass. This is our 3rd masterclass. The first one was on subdivisions. Second one was on character housing, and now we're talking about secondary dwellings, auxiliary units, and dual occupancies. So being that it is a webinar, there is a Q&A box in the Zoom. So if you have a look on there, there will be questions that I can answer throughout, or I'll save to the end. There's also a chat box too, so feel free to distract me on there if you've got any comments or anything. So today, before we get into that, there is a disclaimer. So information provided in this webinar is general information only and should not be used to make any decisions. Like everything in town planning, information provided today is open to interpretation and subject to change at any moment. So if you have any questions about any of the content or require some formal planning advice for your particular circumstances, please give us a call or contact us via that email. So please feel free to do that. Someone's just asked if there's recordings available for the prior 2 webinars. Flick us through an email and we'll get back to you. So what will we be covering today? So we'll first be just giving everyone a bit of an overview on what these uses are. Very, very similar uses, but extremely different, and they have very different results, very different processes, very different costs. So I'll give you a bit of an overview, then we'll jump into what a secondary dwelling is, what the requirements are for most of the councils in Southeast Queensland, the definition of gross floor area, some helpful tips, the rentability of secondary dwellings in the major metropolitan regions, and a bit of other helpful information. We'll then jump into auxiliary units, again, the lawful definition, what it actually means, the Logan City Council requirements and Ipswich City Council requirements, and then some other stuff that kind of helps you hack the best density out of your site. Then lastly, in the 3 topics we're covering is dual occupancies, the definition, some requirements in each council region, some helpful tips, and some really, really good hacks of how you can use that dual occupancy use to get a higher density than council actually wants. We'll then give you a bit of a summary on the differences of each of those. Things like, can you have a letterbox at each of them? Do you have an extra rates notice? Can you have your own driveway? Things like that. We've got a bit of bonus content, so stick around to the end. So if you're still looking at, generating some more revenue from your properties and you can't do any of these uses, then there might be something else that you can do. So we have a bit of bonus content there at the end. A bit of an introduction to ERPEC, where I will be giving you a discount code to do some online courses on property development and town planning. So stick around for that. And then we'll have a bit of time for questions. So like I said earlier, we'll try to wrap this up a little bit earlier for the so everyone can get onto that press conference for the COVID situation. So jumping into the overview. So what is a secondary dwelling? I'm assuming we've all heard a secondary dwelling before, granny flats, as they're more commonly known as. So they're generally an extension to a dwelling house that involves a secondary dwelling. So it's part of the same house, occupied by members of the same household group. So either same family or same group of people. And then it really comes down to what household means. And that's, according to most of the definitions, an individual or group of two or more related or unrelated people who reside in a dwelling. So the issue is whether or not they have an intention to live together on a long-term basis. So what that means is if council came and knocked on your door and they talked to the people living in the, granny flat, if they ask them who lives in the house and they go, oh, I'm not really sure, then there's not really a common intention for those people to be living together. So it's probably not operating like a secondary dwelling anymore. We'll go into that a bit more later. Generally, secondary dwellings are possible in every council region. It falls under the same definition as a dwelling house, so generally you can do it everywhere. Then it comes to auxiliary units. So auxiliary units are very unique use. It's essentially a secondary dwelling that is allowed to be used by a separate household group, but can be rented, but not sold separately. So it can be fully self-contained. So think of it like a secondary dwelling that you can rent. So it's a very unique use. It's only really possible in Southeast Queensland in Logan and Ipswich. New South Wales, for instance, have these kinds of provisions statewide. So you're just allowed to do it wherever you want. Don't take that as advice. We don't operate in New South Wales, but generally in Queensland, an auxiliary unit is a use that's only really available in a couple of council regions. So we'll talk about that a bit more. And then, so the complete opposite end of the scale from a secondary dwelling is a dual occupancy. So a dual occupancy is essentially two houses on the same allotment. So they can be rented separately, they can be strata titled and sold separately. And the best way to describe what a dual occupancy is, it's kind of the same as a townhouse, but it's just two units instead of three or more. So if someone's saying, I've got a dual occupancy or a duplex, then really they're talking about two fully different dwellings on the same property. They could be strata titled, they might not be. It's kind of up to the developer at that point. Most council regions will accept a dual occupancy. It's just obviously subject to assessment and infrastructure charges. So first up, let's have a deeper dive into secondary dwellings. So the lawful definition under the planning regulation in Queensland, it actually puts a secondary dwelling in the same definition as a dwelling house. So here it is. Here I've copied and pasted it. So a dwelling house means a residential use of a premises involving one single dwelling for a household, single household, which is what we were talking about earlier, and a secondary dwelling and any other domestic outbuildings associated with either dwelling also falls under that same definition as a dwelling house. So they're previously also known as a relative's apartment, they were called for a while, a multiple dwelling type A, family accommodation, granny flat. Prior to the Planning Act being released in 2017, each council region, unfortunately, had their own definition of what a secondary dwelling is. So you ended up having, you had a definition for your dwelling house, but you also had a definition for your secondary dwelling, which might have been called a relative's apartment. So it is a bit confusing because there'll be all these older approvals around that say you have approval to operate a family accommodation. And then it's like, well, what does that mean? So generally that all falls under the same definition as a secondary dwelling, which is a dwelling house. What I've done in this table is I've picked the major metropolitan regions that we get inquiries about for secondary dwellings. If you've got one out, if you live somewhere or have investments outside of these areas listed on the screen, then feel free to drop me an email. I'm happy to research your particular area. But this is what you can do in terms of secondary dwellings / granny flats. So in Brisbane, you can have 80 square meters of GFA. GFA means gross floor area. We'll talk about that a bit more. And it has to be within 20 meters of the primary dwelling. So this is very important. So 20 meters away from the primary house. You've then got Logan. In Logan, it depends what zone you're in and how big the property is. So you can have it between 70 square meters and 100 square meters. It has to be within 20 meters of the primary dwelling. Ipswich, 50 square meters, has to be beside or behind. No specific requirement for distance. In Redlands, none applicable. They don't control what kind of secondary dwelling you're allowed to build. So it really comes down to the building regulation and the building certifier. Gold Coast, 80 square meters within 10 to 20 meters of the primary dwelling, again, depending on the size and zoning. Scenic Rim, 60 square meters within 20 meters. Moreton Bay, 45 to 55, etc., etc. So the two things in common here in most council regions is one, you have a maximum floor area that you're allowed, and two, it has to be within a certain proximity of the house. The reason why they have that requirement is because a secondary dwelling should really be part of that primary dwelling. So it's one household. So it wouldn't really make sense to have one household where, you know, the primary dwelling is 200 meters away from the secondary dwelling. It's really obvious at that point that they're not going to be operating as a single household group. So therefore, council enforce these requirements of distance. Gross floor area is referenced a lot, and this is a very important thing to get your head around because you can really hack the amount of floor space that you have by taking advantage, not taking advantage, just interpreting the gross floor area requirement correctly. So gross floor area means the total floor area of all stories of the building measured to the outside of the external walls or center of any common walls in the building. Then this is the important bit, other than areas used for building services, plants, or equipment. So if you have, for example, a room that just has your electricity box in it, that doesn't count towards gross floor area. Access between levels, so staircases don't count towards gross floor area. I've crossed out these two because they're not relevant about what we're talking about. E says parking, loading, and maneuvering of vehicles. So that's a big one because you can have a massive garage and doesn't contribute to your gross floor area. And then the last one, again, is important. So you've got unenclosed private balconies, whether roofed or not. So over here on the corner, we've got this fairly sizable, unit, like that's a decent size house, but it's still only 80 square meters. So the two areas highlighted in red do not contribute to that, for example, in Brisbane, 80 square meters maximum. So you can actually get quite a big house, and it just really needs to be designed appropriately. Sometimes some areas it's just not going to be worthwhile. But it's very good to have that in your back pocket. So I'll just have a look at our questions. We've got some here. Townhouses on a dual occupancy lot. We'll talk about that a bit later. Whether we're covering subdivision or if that's a separate course. Unfortunately, we've done a subdivision masterclass earlier. So please, send an email through. We might be able to send you the link to that masterclass. And then we've got a question for people in Perth. Unfortunately, could not help you. I have no idea what to do in Western Australia. So what I'd recommend doing in Perth is contacting a local town planner and seeing if they can help you out. Jumping back into it. So the other provision in that dwelling house requirement, the distance and provisions for a secondary dwelling is it always talks about distance from the primary dwelling. So the fact that here's two extracts from the code in Brisbane and Logan. So Brisbane says any development for secondary dwelling is 80 square meters maximum gross floor area. So we know how to hack that now. But then it says located within 20 meters of the dwelling house. So that's very important because what is a dwelling house? And we'll get into that in 1 second. Logan City Council has a very similar requirement. So B says is located at maximum 20 meters from the outermost projection of the dwelling house or primary dwelling. So if we then go into what the definition of dwelling house is, it says it includes domestic outbuildings associated with the dwelling. So if we look at this image over here, I mean, 20 meters from the dwelling house is actually quite close. But then they've got this shed over here. So technically that shed is part of the dwelling house. So you could actually build the granny flat within 20 meters of that, because it is still within 20 meters of the primary dwelling. So there's a bit of gray area here, because hypothetically, depending on the council, I have to say, not all councils say this. Some of them say excluding domestic outbuildings. But in theory, you could, for example, if you wanted to build your granny flat in the eastern side of this block, you couldn't, because it'd be more than 20 meters. But if you then put a shed there first, then built the granny flat within 20 meters of the shed, all of a sudden you're okay. So it's very important. This is the importance of knowing about town planning and talking to someone like myself or attending webinars like this, because you can really get into the intricate detail and use it to your advantage. Big questions. Can they be rented separate from the primary dwelling? As you can see here, it's an overwhelmingly no answer. And the reason is a dwelling house, which it usually falls under the definition of, says one single household group resides in a dwelling house. So therefore, how can you rent it unless you're renting it to your grandparents and they still live with you? So it doesn't really work. You can't really rent it. I've got a no, but maybe here for Moreton Bay, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. So, but generally, can you rent out a secondary dwelling or a granny flat? No, you can't. Got a couple more questions here. I may as well jump into them. We've got a question here. Are you getting any pushback from councils with secondary dwellings and the term subordinate in use? So subordinate in use, yeah, that's interesting. We haven't had any pushback. Generally, the people who would get the most issues from council would be the certifiers. So we probably miss out on a lot of the action that happens when council's getting people in trouble. But subordinate in use generally would mean ancillary, so secondary in use to the primary dwelling. But the fact is, it's still got that part in there that says occupied by a single household. And then that's where you still need to make sure that they're very much linked together. So some other helpful notes. So there is some more gray area, as there is in everything in town planning. So then you've got the issue of, well, what's the difference between a detached extension versus a secondary dwelling? So if your secondary dwelling can only be 80 square meters maximum, well, what happens if you just say, well, that's not a secondary dwelling, it's just an extension of my household, and that's not room 1 and 2 of the granny flat, that's room 4 and 5 of my primary house. So for example, a great example is just a pool room. So if you've got a separate little granny flat looking structure next to your pool, it's not a granny flat, it's an extension to your house. So there is a bit of a gray area there, where instead of getting a secondary dwelling approved as a secondary dwelling, get it approved as a detached extension to your primary house. And at that point, you might be able to rent it out separate from the primary house under the Residential Tenancies Rooming Accommodation Act, or as a rooming accommodation. So that's probably something I would recommend following up with the solicitor about, because I'm not going to give anyone advice on whether or not they can rent out their detached extension. So like I've said earlier and throughout, they must be occupied by a single household group. That's fairly self-explanatory. If you don't know who's living in the granny flat personally, then they're not part of your household. A lot of the issues that come up with granny flats are complaint driven. So generally it's disgruntled tenants that get kicked out or do something wrong, or you haven't fixed the tap for a certain amount of time, and then they just dob you into council, and then you're in trouble. The other thing that some councils do is they actually go on Gumtree and look for people's advertising that they have, a granny flat for rent. So you got to watch out for that. Tread carefully. So each council is very different. Councils change their policies about renting frequently. So Gold Coast were allowing you to do it for a while, but then they came out and said that you can't. Moreton Bay, and why I said but maybe with Moreton Bay is, so they did allow you very informally allowed you to rent out granny flats in Moreton Bay. And what they basically did is they had a little extract on their website that said, can I rent out my secondary dwelling? Yes, you can. Then it got removed for a little bit, and then it went back up again for a little bit. And then now it's just disappeared. But if you call them and ask them, they'll say, oh, well, that's still open. We're still discussing that. So the argument is, well, if you just established it now and started renting it, I mean, it doesn't say that you can't. And last time you looked at the website, it said that you could. So, it's going to be hard for them to take action against you committing a development offense because they've just confused it so much. So councils are different. Each one's got completely different provisions. And, you've got to look out for them changing their policy frequently. That being said, places like Redlands have no provisions. So then the question is, well, is sky the limit? Do you just do whatever you want? And that's where you're going to have to speak to your building certifier. Arguably, so long as you can justify it being a secondary dwelling, I can't see why it can't be as big as you want, but there's going to be a limit there. You can't have a 500 square meter, 20 bedroom secondary dwelling. It's not going to fly. And remember, we're just talking about just strictly secondary dwellings. Like there's overlays, there's zonings, there's, areas that it might be banned. There could be protected vegetation. You don't know. So I've got the checklist here, which is check with council, see if you can do it. Once they give you an answer, double check it with a private town planning consultant, someone such as myself or someone from our office. If we tell you it's good to go, or we tell you that there's no issues or there is issues, then still check with a private building certifier. So if you check with those three people, you should be pretty right in terms of what you can and what you cannot do. All righty, let's have a quick look at some questions here. I don't think there's anything new. We've got a question here about, what about Airbnbs for granny flats? So that goes back to the question of, well, if it's an Airbnb, is that granny flat being used as a single household group? And then you got to think, well, no, because it's just someone flying in and using your granny flat for the weekend. So unfortunately, no. Legally, you cannot rent a granny flat as Airbnb. So Airbnbs are generally short-term accommodation uses, which aren't really suitable anywhere. But that's a whole nother webinar. So we will not get into Airbnbs right now. So auxiliary units. So auxiliary units are funny. So you've got your secondary dwellings, and then somehow over the last probably 5 years, this term auxiliary units slowly slipped into everyone's vocabulary. So the lawful definition under the planning regulation of an auxiliary unit, it doesn't exist because it's not a use that's defined under the State Act. So it's something literally that councils have made up, and whether they've made it up so people can take advantage and start doing this, or whether people were already doing it and they just needed to find some way or something to call it. So they're also known as, and I'm sure everyone's heard of these terms, a dual key property, a dual income property. Logan called them a dual occupancy, in brackets, auxiliary unit. So auxiliary units are things you've got to be cautious of, because if someone says you can have a dual key in Moreton Bay, they're probably referring to a dual occupancy, which is a completely different thing. So be very cautious of people telling you that you can do an auxiliary unit. It's pretty much exclusive to Logan City Council and Ipswich City Council regions. So jumping in, because there's not a state definition, we kind of have to look at the definition for each individual council. So Logan City Council call an auxiliary unit, it's a dual occupancy. So bizarrely, an auxiliary unit is a dual occupancy where both dwellings are owned by the same person on one land title, and the auxiliary unit is located on a lot with a minimum size of 450 square meters, has a maximum of 2 bedrooms, 1 kitchen, 1 living space, and a maximum gross floor area of 70 to 100 square meters. So the important things here is that they're owned by the same person on the one title. So they can't be strata titled. If they were strata titled, they're not an auxiliary unit anymore. They're a dual occupancy. It's got limitation on the amount of rooms that you're allowed, which is different, which is a bit different to what you're allowed with the secondary dwelling. And then the interesting part that we've actually really only just picked up on is that it says that they're owned by the same person. Bizarrely, technically, if there was 2 people that owned that title, then you couldn't have an auxiliary unit. If it was a company that owned that title, you couldn't do an auxiliary unit. I mean, that's very technical. No one's controlling it that way, but I think Logan probably need to have a look at their definition there, because that's certainly creating some gray area. So with this definition, essentially you're allowed to have 2 houses, one of them only being this big, and they can be rented separately. Ipswich, very similar outcome, very different approach. So Ipswich actually have the term auxiliary unit as part of their single residential definition, which is kind of like their dwelling house definition. So single residential means the residential use of a premises if there is one dwelling located on its own lot. And this includes an auxiliary unit. So an auxiliary unit then is separately defined, and which means the part of a building used as a secondary residence not exceeding 50 square meters of gross floor area, with a maximum of 1 bedroom, which is attached or associated with the dwelling on the same lot. So as bizarre as it is that they approach it so differently, it actually achieves the same thing. So you can still have an auxiliary unit. You can still rent it separately as a secondary residence. So it doesn't say one household group, it just says secondary residence. And you can rent it separately, but you cannot strata title it, because all of a sudden, again, you would have more than one dwelling on an allotment. So then it would become a duplex. Here is just some extracts from the planning scheme showing you where you could actually put an auxiliary unit in Ipswich. So advantages and disadvantages of an auxiliary unit. Advantages, you can obviously get additional income via rent opposed to a secondary dwelling. So as much as, it might be the exact same building that you're constructing, one you're allowed to rent, one you're not. So you can obviously get additional rent. It's very attractive to investors. I mean, we find all of our clients who are doing subdivisions, in places like Logan and Ipswich, they're really trying to get auxiliary units on all of them, because it's just easier to sell to an investor. So it's going, well, you can buy this one block of land where you can build one house, and you get 1 bit of rent, or you can buy this block of land and it has the ability for 1 house, but also an auxiliary unit, so you get 2 bits of rent from it. Generally, it's quite easy to get approval for auxiliary units if they need approval, and they generally don't. So, it's quite easy to establish an auxiliary unit, and it's not as intensive as doing a dual occupancy. And we'll go into that a little bit later, but an auxiliary unit is very much like building a granny flat that you're allowed to rent. Like, that's it. Go talk to your local builder. Disadvantages, infrastructure charges. So infrastructure charges or contributions, I mean, they can be up to, I think in Logan, they're 23 grand now, I think, per auxiliary unit. So you're really paying for that ability to be able to rent it. And you've got to work that in your feasibility, whether you're looking for, capital gain or whether you're looking for rental return. You've got to factor in that charge, because you might not pay that off for a couple of years, being, a very small rentable little unit. Sometimes they're not a desired outcome for people buying property. If you're splitting a site 1 into 2 and then you put an auxiliary unit on both of them, I mean, owner occupiers might not want to live on this, within stone's throw of 2 households living on the same property. So it can increase the density in small areas, and that's why you get councils changing their policies overnight, because you have this one street, like in Bellbird Park, for instance, down at Ipswich, you've got developments where there's 300 lots, 200 of them have approvals for auxiliary units. So where councils accounted for, 300 families living in an area, 200 of them is actually going to have 2 families. So now you're talking about almost double the amount of people with half the amount of services and infrastructure. So it can create, interesting areas. A lot of car parking is required. In Logan, you have to have 5 car parks on site, which, sometimes is quite difficult and unappealing. Subject to council changing their policy. This is very important, because we have people who buy sites, they're intending to subdivide them and do an auxiliary unit, and then council changes their policy, and then all of a sudden they can subdivide, but they can't do the auxiliary units anymore. So you really need to be on top of it. And if you want to get auxiliary units approved and you are intending on doing it, just get them approved as quickly as possible. Just lock it in. They're locked in for 6 years. So, just do it early and avoid council changing their policy and you being very disappointed. They're also limited in size. So, you've got in Ipswich, you're only allowed 1 bedroom. So they're quite hard to future-proof. If you're thinking, we'll build this auxiliary unit, we'll rent it out for a couple of years, and then we'll use it for the kids can live there. Well, it's like, well, you're building it, but you're only allowed 1 bedroom. So how are you going to then repurpose it later on? And here's a great example of how you can use an auxiliary unit to your advantage. So we had a client come to us a couple of years ago now who wanted to build 4 townhouses on a site. And here's the stats. So that would have been worth about $1,200 a week, we'll call it, in rental income. Then the equity or value of those 4 townhouses would be 1.2 mil. So it's in in Logan, so it's not the highest yielding area, but still not too bad. But we had more of did some development consulting and figured out they could actually subdivide the property and split it into 4 allotments and put 4 dwelling houses and 4 auxiliary units on there. So the auxiliary units actually ended up being about the size of the townhouses. So we ended up having 8 rentable incomes instead of 4. So we've turned their $1,200 a week into $2,500 a week. And then the equities, 4 freehold allotments with dual income on each lot. So, their total equity has gone up by 800,000. Obviously, they're more expensive to build, more upkeep, sometimes infrastructure charges payable. But, you can, if you're after rental income, then it's a very, very good thing to do. We'll have a quick look at some questions they've been firing in. Which council permits, encourages which type of development? BCC with rooming accommodation. I'll talk about that a bit later. Someone's asked, how can you find out each council area's rules for dual key properties? So I've just basically talked about them. So I would just Google, auxiliary unit Logan, auxiliary unit Ipswich, and then just see what information comes up on Google. We have a question for an attached auxiliary unit in Logan or Ipswich. Does there need to be a fire separation between the main house and the auxiliary unit? Very good question. Unfortunately, in terms of fire separation, I would be deferring my answer off to a building certifier. I would imagine that you would need, if you've got 2 completely separate households, that you would need a firewall, but I'm not 100% sure. So I would probably talk to a building certifier. I'll take one more question. The question is, do you need to provide private open space for auxiliary unit that is separate from the main house? So for an auxiliary unit, no, you don't. So there's no code that I'm aware of that makes you have dedicated private open space for an auxiliary unit. Alrighty, bit in the chat. Here we go. Damien, yes, you need a 60-60-60 fire rated wall between the auxiliary unit and the primary dwelling. So Damien, I'm assuming you're a building certifier, but otherwise, thank you very much for that input. So a couple of notes on auxiliary units. What about other local government areas? Unfortunately, you can't do it. It just doesn't exist in their planning scheme. Can you do multiple auxiliary units on the same property? Well, no, because they all say you can only have 1 in the definition. Make note of that definition. They all refer to gross floor area. So again, you can use that definition to hack the amount of space that you have. So it doesn't include car parking, doesn't include servicing areas, doesn't include decks and things. So, make sure you check that. Another thing which we get all the time is just because the people down the road did it doesn't mean that you can. Policy changes all the time. I'm going to say Logan's changed their policy on auxiliary units at least 5 times, and significantly, not just small changes like, you can't do this anymore, or you have to pay charges now. So, if you're already operating and it changes, that's absolutely fine. But if you're thinking about starting or getting an approval for one and it changes, you're kind of screwed. You do, under the Act, you have, a year to lodge an application under the superseded scheme and all this stuff. But, it's unlikely that council would jump on board for that. Again, remember, there's a lot of other planning things that can come into it. So just because you could do an auxiliary unit doesn't mean you can. So there could be overlays stopping you, protected vegetation. So again, check with council, check with the town planner, check with the building certifier. You should be pretty right. All right. Got a question here. Someone's listening while they're driving. They've got an appointment at 11. Can you watch the recording, yes. So if you've attended this webinar, you will get a copy of this email to you shortly after. So you'll be able to rewatch. So if you have to jump off now or a bit earlier, then you will get a copy of it and you can watch it a bit later. So thanks for that. All right, now on to the last topic, dual occupancy. So this is kind of the highest level of having two properties or two dwellings on the same property. So dual occupancy, the definition under the planning regs is two dwellings on a single lot, whether attached or detached. We get a lot of questions about whether or not a duplex and a dual occupancy are the same thing. Under this planning scheme, they are the same thing. They might have different requirements under the building codes, but for purposes of what we're looking at, they're the same thing. So they don't have to, you'll notice that this definition does not say that they have to have one household group. You can have two households, which basically means you're an auxiliary unit, but you're allowed to have two dwellings on the same lot, whereas an auxiliary unit, you only have one dwelling with an associated auxiliary unit. So also known as duplex, dual key. Like I said earlier, people do call dual occupancies dual keys in areas where you can't do auxiliary units. Yes, it's very confusing. It's very confusing for us because people call and go, I want to do a dual key here. And we go, well, you can't do a dual key. And they're like, well, I'm pretty sure I can. And then once we look at it, we realize they're asking for a dual occupancy. And then Logan geniusly called auxiliary unit, duplexes or dual occupancies. In some parts of the scheme, they call it a dual occupancy auxiliary unit. So because it's not a dual occupancy auxiliary unit, it's a dual occupancy. These are some pretty loose requirements in each council region. They change zone to zone, precinct to precinct. So I've kind of just done a general overview. In Brisbane, you're looking at low, medium density residential zone, 600 square meters and greater. Logan, most residential zones, not all of them. So you've got to check with council or check with us. Ipswich, again, available in most areas. Generally, you need an 800 square meter lot or greater. Redlands, again, low density zones is where they want them, 800 square meter lots minimum. Gold Coast, you're allowed them in most zones. Bizarrely, in Gold Coast, there's no minimum lot size. It comes down to minimum frontage, which is quite unique. Scenic Rim, most zones you're allowed them, 800 square meters or greater. There's a bit of a trend going on here. Moreton Bay, again, most residential zones you're allowed them. It definitely changes zone by zone in Moreton Bay, but generally you need 1,000 square meters or greater. Sunshine Coast, you're allowed them in most zones. There's not really a lot of provisions in there. Noosa, you're only allowed them in medium density residential zones. So there's a lot of variance there. So I would not take this table and treat it as gospel. So if you have a site that you want to do a dual occupancy on, that's when you need to contact council, contact the town planner, talk to a building certifier. So some notes with dual occupancies. Infrastructure charges will be payable. So you won't be able to avoid it. Infrastructure charges will be anywhere between 20 to 31,000, depending on where it is and how many bedrooms you have. There's generally not a limitation in any planning scheme that I'm aware of that will limit what number of bedrooms or living areas or anything that you're allowed in a dual occupancy. So it's kind of like two full households that you're allowed to construct. It's much more of a formal development, if you like. So, a secondary dwelling is like a granny flat, go for it. Auxiliary unit, granny flat, you can rent out. Dual occupancy, now we're talking about a formal development. Approvals almost likely every time. There are areas that you don't need approval, like Logan. Trying to think other places. I think it's just Logan, actually. So there are areas that you don't need approval, but it's always good to check. And because it's more of a formal development, you're going to be required to address the secondary codes of the planning scheme. So all of a sudden, you're not just looking at, here's my auxiliary unit, I've got enough car parks. Now you're triggering, the landscape planning scheme policy, the TAPS policy for transport access, parking and servicing. So you're going to have to address things like landscaping, car parking, streetscape upgrades, stormwater discharge, servicing, slope. So it really becomes a larger development process. Obviously, the advantage of a dual occupancy is they can be strata tiled and sold separately. So they could be rented separately. You don't have to strata title them. But at some point in time, if you wanted to sell them, then you can strata title them. You can also subdivide approved dual occupancies. So long as you keep a small portion of communal space, so like a bin area, for example, you can actually subdivide the approved dual occupancy. So that's something to take into account too. Generally, dual occupancies are more costly to construct. There's rates payable. Usually you need a full formal approval, things like that. Here are some pretty helpful hacks that we've come across over our time. So Brisbane City Council, so the minimum requirement for a dual occupancy is 600 square meters with 15 meter frontage. That being said, we've had one approved on a 350 square meter lot. So we see them get approved all the time on 400 square meter lots with a 10 meter width. So where you think that you're buying a property that only has potential for a house, if it's in an LMR zone, people are starting to do duplexes on them. So doubling that rentable income or doubling that, that value. And generally, dual occupancies don't attract the same car parking rates as a townhouse. So what you can also do is, if you're subdividing, so instead of doing 4 townhouses on a property, you could subdivide that property into 2 lots and do 2 dual occupancies, and you'd fit more on there. So definitely worth considering dual occupancies when you're looking at property development in Brisbane. Now in Logan, it's a bit of a different case. So you can really use dual occupancy to hack your density. So Logan operate on a maximum equivalent dwelling size. So if you've got a subdivision like this one over here, where we can max out the amount of allotments that you're allowed. So just say, what do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just say you're only allowed 6 allotments as part of this subdivision. If we left 1,000 square meter lot, then you could subdivide this into 6, and then later on, you're allowed to do a duplex on here without any approval. So now you've got 7 properties out of a site that you're only allowed 6. So very good to hack your density, and you can do that. You can take that as far as you want to. And they also allow you to have a high density on corners. So if you've got a corner site, for example, in the suburban precinct, instead of having 1 dwelling per 500 square meters, you're allowed 1 dwelling per 350. So now you've got a 700 square meter site that you're allowed to have a duplex on. Extremely handy in some circumstances. Some councils, like I said earlier, don't require approval for a duplex. So if you need to get something up and running very quickly, then a dual occupancy is a great thing to have a quick look at. I'll take a couple of questions because I can see the questions bar firing away. Here we go. We've got May. We've got a question about doing this in Perth. Again, sorry, I can't help you in Perth. I'd recommend talking to a local town planner. Minimum lot sizes per zoning for dual locks in Brisbane and Sunshine Coast. Unfortunately, that's a pretty detailed question, but please flick me an email and I'd be happy to have a look at what the minimum lot sizes are per zone. David's asked me to talk a little bit about site coverage in Logan. It's a bit complicated in Logan. The reason being site coverage will depend on how large your site is and what precinct it's in. So very complicated question, simple question, complicated answer. So David, if you want to flick me an email, I'm happy to have a look into that for you. Or if you have a very specific question about a particular zone, please let me know. Anonymous has asked, do frontage requirements apply to a rear lot? They do. So the issue is you don't have a frontage for a rear lot, so therefore you generally couldn't comply with the requirements for accepted development, or you couldn't comply with the 20 meter requirement. So therefore you would trigger a non-compliance. Anonymous has also asked about New South Wales supplementary dwelling criteria. Unfortunately, we don't operate in New South Wales, but I'm happy to get you in contact with someone if you like. Anonymous has asked low density infill loopholes. I've kind of covered off a couple of those. Here's one from Anonymous, beyond the council town planners, how to really find out what's possible with the property you're thinking about buying. Step by step would be lovely. Yep, so the best thing you can do about finding out the potential of a property is to give us a call. Give either council a call or a private town planning consultant a call, and we can really step you through what the potential is with a site. Anonymous has asked how to track or know about rezoning by council in advance. Probably another side to that is how to track how councils or when council's policy is going to change. The only way that you can do it is sign up to every single council notifications blast possible. So the first thing you can do, go on the council website, go to the contact page, sign up for any notifications about amendments to the scheme, and then that's where you will find out. So you got to be very proactive with that and be, basically if council make an announcement every single time, you need to review it and see how it affects you. David has asked, just wondering if my 30-meter squared nursery enclosed area is part of an allowable site coverage. David, it probably depends on the council that you're referring to. And then what I'd recommend doing is researching that planning scheme and looking at the definition of site coverage and seeing if a 30 square meter nursery would count. I would say if it has a roof and it's enclosed, that it would contribute to your site coverage. So sorry about that. Last question I've got, and then I'll jump back into the webinar because we're getting towards the end, is what do our online courses cover? I'll get into that in a second, so hold steady. So in summary, what are the differences between an auxiliary unit, a secondary dwelling, and a dual occupancy? And there you go. I've put it into a very easy to read table. So what I would probably recommend doing is if you're watching, just screenshotting this page, alternatively rewatch it and download this page, because this is a great overview of the differences. So for example, in a secondary dwelling, no letterbox is allowed. Auxiliary unit, you might be allowed one. Dual occupancy, you have to have one. So there's a lot of limitations, there's a lot of requirements, and this is a great little table to check it out. So here's some bonus content. So, everyone wants to do an auxiliary unit, sometimes you can't. So there are other things in other council regions that are similar or will allow you to get a higher rental yield, but might not necessarily be an auxiliary unit. So in Scenic Rim, they now allow you to have what they define as a holiday home. And a holiday home is extremely, if not identical to an Airbnb. So you're allowed a self-contained, separate dwelling from your own that where they're allowed to, where visitors have the right to occupy the entire house, and you can do that on a short-term basis. So that's probably something good to look into. So there's a question earlier about, Airbnb, that's where you could do it under that definition. As I alluded to earlier, Moreton Bay, they did let you rent out granny flats for a while, then they stopped, then they let you again, now they've stopped again. So it's a bit of a gray area. And if you really wanted to run a risky, operation, then you could probably rent them out and just really fall under a gray area. The risk you have is that council come and shut you down immediately. So, take that into account when you're making any decisions. And then in Brisbane, they have a use called rooming accommodation, where you can have 5 unrelated people, not necessarily, living in one household group, but it's still, you're renting individual parts of the house. So that's probably something to investigate too. So we're kind of getting to the end now. So if you enjoy learning about property development and town planning, there is a business that I founded called URPEC, which is the Urban and Regional Planning Education Center. And this was created because there seems to be this very big gap between what you learn at university and what you can learn on the tools. So our courses basically teach you what you should be learning at university. And by doing that and teaching undergraduate town planning students, we realized, well, actually this information is very valuable to the property development sector also. So we have courses such as, we have a site finding course in Brisbane. We have our first workshop next week, which we're just waiting to see what happens with COVID. We have a full development assessment course. So this is, if you wanted to be a town planner and you wanted to do what I do for a living, this course will give you literally the practical knowledge and experience that you need to get started. We have a whole course in character housing, which is extremely interesting. So if you like Queenslanders and you like old houses and history, this is a great course to do. And then we also have a koala planning provisions course, which is a bit more detailed on koala planning provisions under the regulation, but very important if you are a planner. So you can see the price of these over the top. So $350, $1,500, $200. This one's also $200. And just if you've attended this webinar, which is quite a few of you, so it's 50% off if you want to do any of those courses. So URPEC is a separate business to Steffan Town Planning, but I've organized this coupon code for you all. So if you sign up for any of those courses, you can get a once-off discount of 50%. So that means some of those courses are quite cheap, especially for the value you get out of them. And just use this webinar, this coupon code here. So STP webinar, And that's the website there, urpec.com.au. So if you have any further questions, email me, give me a call, visit our website. We have a lot of content on there. Add me on LinkedIn. I love talking with people on LinkedIn, bringing up controversial topics and letting the community talk it out. I seem to be the guy that does that now. And we have our next masterclass next month. So we've been taking suggestions, which is why we ended up doing one on dual occupancies and auxiliary units. But please send us a suggestion. If you've got something that you want us to talk about, please let us know. And I would love to custom make an entire webinar for it. Again, check out urpec.com.au. It's a wealth of information on there, and they're very cheap on-demand courses. So you can go in there, do them whenever you want, and you can always go back to them. So if you forget something, you can always log on later. So we have finished a little bit earlier, as promised. Oh, not a little bit earlier, only 7 minutes earlier. So I'll just check the Q&A. There's a Dee's ask about the seminar next week. There'll be an email blast out about that. So please stay tuned. And then the other question is, if you wanted to build 2 townhouses on a dual occupancy block, is it better to build one first so you can still live in your home while it's being built, then move to the new dwelling, or knock down one and then build? Oh, that's a anonymous attendee. That's a pretty complicated question. So maybe flick me an email and I'd be happy to have a look and see how I can be of assistance. The issue you might have with that is you can't just have, if you're living in one house and then you're trying to build another and then you knock the other one down, then at some point in that you're only having one house there, not 2 houses, which is not a duplex. So yeah, but flick me an email because it's probably a bit more of a complicated question. So that brings us to a close. Thank you everyone very much for attending today. I hope you all got a bit of value out of it. This webinar will be emailed to everyone. So if you have any further questions, you can log in later and have a listen or watch the slides again. Check out URPEC. Unbelievably good content there, readily available for you to digest when you want. And yeah, otherwise, thank you very much and good luck with COVID. There's an announcement in 5 minutes, so we'll see what happens there. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye.